So we're here at Budget 2018 in the Beehive Theaterette. It's 10:30 in the morning when we start these things. We're allowed to get out of this lock-up at 2 o'clock, so we got the thick end of 4 hours, and we're going to need a lot of that time to pour through all this documentation, pages and pages of it, obviously, in terms of what the government's priorities are for their first budget of this term. Remember, this is the first Labour budget in nearly 10 years. There's a lot to dole out here. The government will spend the thick end of $90 billion, so there's a lot of money to actually go to a lot of areas. And Grant Robertson's first budget, the big number that jumps out at me immediately is a $3 billion plus surplus. So he has managed to balance the books, and more than that, and he's managed to keep within the budget rules that he's set for himself.
This budget builds on the 100-day plan and mini-budget, which had a significant focus on reducing poverty and making sustained investments in our long-term future, such as Kiwi Build, the New Zealand Super Fund, and education skills and training. The economic and fiscal outlook is good. Across the forecast period, GDP growth remains solid. Unemployment tracks down to 4.1% by the end of the period, on track to meet the government's goal of 4%. Average annual wage growth is forecast at over 3% over the next 4 years. 203,000 more jobs will be created by the end of the forecast period. Inflation is initially lower than the projection at Haifu, going from 2% to 1.4%, but picks up to around the midpoint of the Reserve Bank's inflation target band at 2% from 2020. Our budget spending decisions have been made with an eye to monetary policy and to retaining a balance between fiscal discipline and delivering the essential investments needed in the New Zealand economy. GDP growth is forecast to rise from 2.8% in the June 2018 quarter to a peak of 3.6% in the December 2019 quarter, before easing to around 2.5% in June 2022. Forecast GDP growth is due to peak a little later than forecast at Haifu. This is influenced by adverse weather events affecting agriculture. Thereafter, the impact of government investment, including the Families Package and Kiwi Build, support higher growth in the latter half of the forecast period compared with what was forecast at Haifu. Per capita growth follows a similar trend. As we have already said, this is a transition period for the economy before we move to more sustainable and more productive growth. In the 5 years to June 2022, nominal GDP is cumulatively $6 billion higher than forecast in Haifu, after adjusting for the revised starting point. As I'm sure you are all aware, we are committed to our 5 budget responsibility rules. Budget 2018 shows that we are meeting these rules. They remain important to giving certainty about our fiscal approach. They provide us with the resources to make significant and sustained investments with an eye on the well-being of future generations.
We've made our way through the documents sitting on the tables there. A lot to read, Jane, a lot to take in, a lot of expectation given it was the first Labour budget for the thick end of a decade. What are your thoughts?
So the government really campaigned hard on being a good economic manager, and they have stuck to their budget responsibility rules. They've kept within those limits. Big expectations around health and education and housing delivered, but maybe not as big as people might expect. Grant Robertson, the Finance Minister, really making the point that this is the first budget out of 3, so putting some money in, but maybe some of those sectors might be a bit disappointed.
Yeah, when you look at health, for example, they're not putting in a lot more than what National was putting in, and not a lot more than the average cost that it takes when you consider population and cost increases. The stand still, if you like, the money that you need to put in just to keep things standing still, not a lot more than that.
That's right. So the operating money, so the money that's going to go to DHBs, not a huge amount more, as you would say, in terms of meeting those cost and population pressures. I think the increase was in that capital spending, so that's going to be money to go to fixing up hospitals and getting some of that asset management taken care of. But again, not as big as some estimates had been, actually, just to get the sector back to where it should have been. Not much higher above that.
It really looked like he was trying to prove his economic credentials. He's delivered a surplus more than $3 billion. They peak out at $7 billion. That's a lot of money to have in terms of money left over. It looked to me like he was really trying to drive that argument home very strongly and set his reputation early on rather than handing out the lollies, if you like.
I think a government also has to, in its first term and its first year, really prepare for the unknowns. Of course, we saw the Christchurch earthquake that the national government had to deal with and had to borrow more for. So Grant Robertson taking quite a conservative approach, hinting, of course, that over the next couple of years you really might see that spending ramp up. And, of course, election year budgets, politicians always like to have a bit of money to throw around on those budgets going into election year in 2 years' time.
And speaking of the politics of it, I mean, not a lot of difference between the Green vote and the New Zealand First vote at the election. There's a couple of percentage points in it. But when you look at the money doled out, wow, New Zealand First does pretty well compared to the Greens, don't they?
You really see the influence, particularly of New Zealand First, the Deputy the Deputy Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, Winston Peters in this budget. New Zealand First have had significant gains in terms of that provincial growth fund and then that massive spend for foreign affairs and in particular Pacific Aid. And one of the policies we thought quite interesting to fulfil a racing policy for New Zealand First, tax deductions for standout yearlings, good-looking, good bloodline horses.
Yeah, $5 million on that. One of the things that I saw that didn't look that significant was the spending on Maori initiatives. $37 million spread out over 4 years, thick end of about $9 million a year. You got all those Maori seats, you got some powerful cabinet ministers there. Did they really deliver?
I think for Grant Robertson it's a matter of the demands across all of those portfolios, and I imagine the government will argue that Māori will benefit from the housing, the health, the education, those separate, those specific portfolio initiatives, but no, not a lot of spending specifically on Māori policies, which might be seen as disproportionate, particularly as Labour's Māori MPs have done well for them in this election and last election. In fact, they were the only MPs, they really were the standout performers in that election, so I would have thought they would have been looking for a little bit more in terms of this budget.
And just finally, another thing that wasn't in there, the prisons. I mean, we've talked a lot about this big new prison in Waikeria that's going to have to make a decision on it, but they look to have kicked that can down the road a bit.
They have. They've said that the money that National had put aside is still there in the budget, but the government hasn't decided whether to do this massive upgrade of Waikeria. Now, they are really in a position where they're grappling with massive prison population growth increases, but they don't want to build new prisons. So in this budget we've seen money for community housing, we've seen outlining different policies to try to keep people out on bail, out on parole a bit more. So that is something that really they're going to have to deal with soon, because this is a problem that's not going to go away, and they will have to decide whether to build more prisons or whether to actually put more people out into the community and have the facilities necessary for that.
Thanks, Jane. Now, the big highlight of the budget, the sausage rolls are on. We better go and grab some.
That's right.